Hi, my name is Heather McClanahan. First of all, I want to thank you for being here. Our volunteers are just such a core of what we do. We could not do what we do without them, and I really, really appreciate your time. And I hope if you have any questions when you get through this training that you will contact me. As I said, my name is Heather. I am the executive director here at the Los Alamos Historical Society, and sharing this history is absolutely one of my passions. We are going to talk today about the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. It is the reason that most of our visitors come to see us, and although we love telling the stories of the ranch school and the many other stories that we have in Los Alamos, this is the bulk of why folks are here. So let's go ahead and dive right in. One of the things that you need to be very clear about is what the Manhattan Project was. It wasn't just a top secret project. It was a top secret project that would build the atomic bombs and end World War II. Certainly a component of this was a race to beat the Nazis to weapons of mass destruction. Most of the physics work that was going on in the world in the 1930s was based with European scientists, especially in Germany. And there was a big fear amongst the refugees that were coming to the United States, the scientific refugees, that Germany was going to develop one of these weapons. And the fear of Hitler having one was something that drove many of the scientists to come and work on the Manhattan Project. It was an enormous undertaking of science. That's what most people think of it as. It was theoretical and experimental science, and it was a huge engineering project. In fact, there are those who believe that really the bulk of what the Manhattan Project did was engineering, that the science was already figured out. But hopefully you can tell when I'm joking and kidding on this tape that the inflections of my voice will make it even if you can't see my face. But seriously, engineering was a huge part of the project, and there were hundreds and hundreds of engineers who did work on the Manhattan Project as well as the scientists. So I always like to coming from a family of engineers, call it a science and engineering project. The Manhattan Project, it has been speculated, has employed possibly up to 600,000 people. Now, many of those people were working on very small components of it. They certainly did not realize they were working on it. If you combine the three cities of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, and Los Alamos, that's where you're going to get 125,000 people. But there were people all over the nation that were working in uranium mining and uranium milling and the triggers in Dayton, Ohio, and all these different places where work was going on that was part of the Manhattan Project that wasn't in one of the three big cities. And so Alex Wellerstein, who does a wonderful blog called Nuclear Secrecy, has speculated that it could be up to 600,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project. And one of the things that you will hear when you are working in the museum or the Beta House or even as a tour guide is many people will come and tell us that their uncle worked on the Manhattan Project. And they usually have no idea what their uncle did, often don't know where their uncle may have worked on the project. But we used to kind of get a kick out of it that so many uncles had worked on the project. But then we started doing the math. And if you figure out of those 600,000, if 2/3 of those were men, and then of course the baby boom comes along after the war, and people are having 4 and 5 kids per family, pretty soon everybody's uncle did work on the Manhattan Project. And so when you hear that, don't be too surprised. One of the questions our visitors often ask is, why was it called the Manhattan Project? I mean, there's all this top secret work going on. It's being done in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in Hanford, Washington, in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Where did the Manhattan come from? Well, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was first put in charge of the project in 1941 by President Roosevelt. And they were based in it was the North Atlantic office, the North Atlantic Division, and they were based in Manhattan. So this was General Groves' predecessor, and he was unappointed when General Groves was appointed in 1942. So the headquarters of this engineering group was in Manhattan. They were coming up with names, things like this one listed here, the Laboratory for the Development of Substitute Materials. Now, if you were a spy, think something like that might get your attention? And General Groves was very concerned when he took over the project in September of 42 about spies. He was very concerned about, people figuring out that this was going on. And, for him, if there's work being done all over the country, and especially these three different states, if you just say Manhattan, then, it might not draw as much attention. And then the sites themselves were also top secret names. Los Alamos was known as Project Y, and so you'll hear that. Oak Ridge was Project X, and then Hanford was Project W, not Z. And we don't know if that's because it was in Washington. We really don't know if there's a particular reason for it. But so Project X, Z, X, Y, and W. So there you go. All right, so that's why it was called the Manhattan Project. Now, who are the key players? General Leslie Groves was the military director of the project. He was Colonel Groves when he was brought into Washington to oversee the building of the Pentagon, which was having all kinds of problems getting done. It was the world's largest building. And he got that done on time and under budget. By the time he was finished with it, World War II had started, and he thought he was going to receive a combat assignment. He was a West Point graduate and expected that. But his boss came to him and instead appointed him to this top secret project that was going on that, his boss told him, first of all, we're promoting you from colonel to general. Second of all, we're giving you a practically unlimited budget. And if you get this thing done, you're going to win the war. And when now General Groves looked at his boss and said, what happens if we don't get the project done? His boss never really answered that question. General Groves was a logistical genius. He absolutely could look at problems and figure out in his head multiple solutions with, multiple branches coming off that for more things that would happen. He was not necessarily a very easy person to work with or a very nice person, but he was very good at getting things done. And so when he took over the Manhattan Project, he was going to get it done, and that's absolutely what he set about to do. He appointed as his scientific director Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, and I'm going to talk more about Oppenheimer in just a minute, but I do want you to understand that this is quite an unlikely pair. General Groves was a very right-wing, black and white, my way or the highway kind of guy, and Dr. Oppenheimer was very left-leaning, had spoke many languages, was very into poetry, those kinds of things. And so they were quite an unlikely match, but they got along very well together. And historians have speculated over the years that Oppenheimer and Groves may have seen in each other what they were lacking to essentially achieve immortality. And that is part of the reason that they got on quite well, worked well together, and were able to succeed in developing the weapons that they developed to end World War II. You will hear many other names as part of the project. Dorothy McKibben was, of course, the gatekeeper at 109 East Palace in Santa Fe. She is the person who met all of the incoming civilians at her office there just across the street from La Fonda. And she would make arrangements for them to get their passes, to get their luggage and their furniture transported up to Los Alamos, all those kinds of things Dorothy was in charge of. And there's a really wonderful biography of her called Gatekeeper to Los Alamos by Nancy Steeper, and I highly recommend reading that just to learn more about Dorothy's story. Enrico Fermi was an Italian scientist who won the 1938 Nobel Prize in Physics. His wife was Jewish, and so when he went to collect that prize in Sweden, he and his family picked up the money and fled to the United States. Fermi would lead the experiment at the University of Chicago that created the world's first sustained nuclear reaction and was an integral part of what happened here in Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Several biographies have been written about him, a couple recently, and then one really good book that is at the library is called Atoms in the Family by his wife, Laura, so I can recommend that. Hans Bethe was a German physicist who fled to the United States and was a brilliant theoretical physicist. He worked in Los Alamos not only during the Manhattan Project, but on and off during the Cold War, and he was a wonderful mentor and teacher to many people at the laboratory over the years. We, in fact, of course, have as part of our campus the Hans Bethe House, where Hans and his wife lived for just a short time after the war, and he was just really a integral part, as I say, of the project and then the post-war years and of scientists who were working on weapons of mass destruction. And he felt like, they needed to have a say in what was going on. Niels Bohr was a Danish physicist who had won the Nobel Prize. He didn't actually spend time working on the Manhattan Project, but he did come to Los Alamos in, I believe it was 1944, and it was at a real downtime for the laboratory because they were having problems with the development of the Fat Man bomb. And he really just kind of came in and helped cheer everybody up. There's a really good uh, description of this in the book 109 East Palace by Jeanette Conant. And so if you want to learn more about that, you can read in there. George Kistiakowsky was the explosives expert on the Manhattan Project. He lived in the little powerhouse, the Red Cross building on Bathtub Row. And he used to blow up trees on the ski hill to make ski runs. He was using his government-issued explosives for that. John Manley was one of Oppenheimer's right-hand men, stayed in Los Alamos for many years after that, and was an integral part of the community. Robert Serber and Robert Bacher were both, Oppenheimer almost needs like 6 right hands because these were also right-hand men for him. And there is a short biography on Robert Bacher that the Historical Society has available. Deke Parsons is an interesting story. He was a naval commander, and yet he was assigned to the mountains of New Mexico during World War II. And it was because he was an ordnance expert, and we needed an ordnance expert on the project. He was also, like General Groves, a logistical genius and really was essentially the, Oppenheimer's assistant director. He had his fingers in just about every pie that went on with the project and really, really helped a lot. Edwin McMillan was the 1951 Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. He actually lived in the Hans Bethe house during the war, the duration of the war, right next door, of course, to Oppenheimer, and did a lot of work in transuranic chemistry that was critically important to the project. One of my favorite stories out of the Manhattan Project is the Special Engineer Detachment. This was a group of young men who were drafted out of college generally. They were majoring in engineering, chemistry, and physics, and they were brought as Army privates for the most part to Los Alamos. There were about 1,600 of them here, and they essentially worked as the lab rats. And the great part of this story is after the war was over, many of them went on to obtain their PhDs. I mean, they'd been working in laboratories with all of these Nobel Prize winners and all of these great scientists. And so they went on, they would obtain PhDs, and several of them actually won Nobel Prizes and headed physics departments at major universities throughout the country, including University of Colorado and UNM. So, it's just a really neat story, and I encourage you to learn more about the SEDs and the role that they played, not only in the Manhattan Project, but post-war in their contributions to the United States. And of course, the WACs are the Women's Army Corps. This is, again, a very important group of young ladies that were up here who served as truck drivers and telephone operators and secretaries and were just, the project could not have happened without the immense amount of work and effort tirelessly that they put in. The Christian Science Church is over on 17th Street, is an old WAC dorm. It's one of the few remaining World War II buildings we have here in town because, of course, General Groves never intended Los Alamos to be a permanent community. And so I encourage you to go take a look at that building. It looks just like it did during the time of the WACs, and it's a really neat place to get a sense of place of where they lived and what they went through. Why was Los Alamos chosen for the project? Well, when General Groves first hired Oppenheimer as his scientific director, he told him that all these scientists need to quit talking to each other. There's work going on at Columbia University, at MIT, at the University of Chicago, at University of California, Berkeley, where Oppenheimer was. So all this work is going on all over the country, and Groves is just terrified of the idea of spies getting a hold of it. And so he told Oppenheimer the scientists had to quit talking to each other. And Oppenheimer gently explained to him that science doesn't work that way, that scientists need to be able to talk to each other, to expand upon each other's ideas, and develop new concepts and work together. So the general agreed that all of the scientists could be put in one place. And he had some criteria for that. He wanted it to be remote. It needed to be 600 miles in from a coast because he didn't want it subject to naval attack. The idea of having a place in the Southwest was favorable because generally the weather is nicer here more times out of the year than it is anywhere else. General Groves needed a place that was easy to patrol. He wanted to have a nearby workforce as long as that workforce wasn't too close, and nearby transportation as long as it wasn't too close. And if they could have some infrastructure like running water and electricity, well, that would be icing on the cake. Oppenheimer had a great love of New Mexico that we're going to talk about in just a second. And one of his requirements was inspiring vistas. Los Alamos met all of these. There was a road that came in from the Jemez Mountains, as well as the dirt road that went up the main hill that belonged to the Los Alamos Ranch School. With our mesas and canyons, it was easy to patrol. In the nearby Hispanic and Pueblo villages, there was workforce. With the train at Lamy, there was nearby transportation. And then the Los Alamos Ranch School, of course, had buildings, electricity, running water. So that is why Los Alamos was chosen for the Manhattan Project. It had all the criteria. General Groves, Dr. Oppenheimer, and some other people on the selection committee actually traveled in several places in the Southwest. They looked in St. George, Utah, but General Groves did not want to be in Utah. And so they came to New Mexico. They looked at Las Vegas, and he thought the plains were too wide open there. They looked at Gallup. He thought that the train going through town wasn't going to work. They went to Jemez Springs, which some of the committee members had actually chosen. They thought that Jemez Springs was going to be the site. But General Groves didn't like it. He thought the canyon was too deep, too dark. It's November of 1942 when he's visiting, and it just bothered him. So Oppenheimer and a couple of the other people suggested they just drive right over the hill on what's now State Road 4 to come to the boys' school that was here. And they did. And as soon as General Groves got out of the car and saw Fuller Lodge, saw that ready-made dining hall, he said, yeah, this is the place. And so the letter that is in the museum, in the ranch school room there, was received by the school on December 7th of 1942. It was exactly a year after Pearl Harbor. Now, the school was struggling a bit at this point. The masters were, of course, all going off to fight the war. Parents were reluctant to send their boys out during wartime, and so finances were a little tight. And when the government plunked down this large offer to buy up the school for a top-secret war project, it was actually accepted right away. The offer wasn't. They actually had to sue to get the money they wanted. And the great thing about the lawsuit is we have in our archives a list of every single item, every saddle, every bridle, every bit of kitchen equipment, every building that came from the Los Alamos Ranch School to the United States Army during that takeover. So that's kind of a neat document that we have as well, along with this letter from the War Department. The school canceled their winter vacations that year, and the seniors were allowed to graduate in the late January of 1943. They held their graduation right down in the Pajarito room, as there were bulldozers up here on the site already starting to build labs and housing. And so the school closed, and almost everyone left. There were some Hispano farmers in the area who ended up coming to work for the Manhattan Project, the most famous of those being, of course, Bencis Gonzalez, who worked for the ranch school, was from a homestead family, and stayed and worked for the Manhattan Project. Robert Oppenheimer loved New Mexico. Why did he love New Mexico? Well, he had been a young man graduating from high school and getting ready to enter Harvard when he became ill. He had a friend from school, from his years at the Ethical Cultural School in New York, who was from New Mexico. And so his parents sent him out, like many people in the early 1900s, to recover in New Mexico. They ended up renting a place in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and he absolutely fell in love with northern New Mexico. They eventually bought that place. It's still there. The family still owns it today. It's called Perro Caliente. Hot dog, because the first time Oppenheimer saw it, he said hot dog, and that was, of course, Spanish, Perro Caliente, for hot dog. Oppenheimer would come out here from Berkeley every summer. and would bring his graduate students and his girlfriends and his friends, and they would jump on horses and they would ride all over northern New Mexico. So he knew very well about the um, the ranch school and the location and the infrastructure that it had. And so I think when General Groves told him he could have a top secret laboratory, that he knew right away where he wanted it to be. But he let the general look at some of those other places first to make sure that this one really was going to be the best. Oppenheimer felt that the broad landscapes that we have up here, looking across at the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and up to the Jemez Mountains, would inspire his scientists, and in fact, it did. And as we mentioned, the ranch school had the needed infrastructure. There is a myth out there that is prevalent. Stomp it out all the time, and that is that Oppenheimer attended the ranch school. He did not. He did not attend the ranch school. He knew about it because of his rides in northern New Mexico, but he was never a student here. This picture is actually a post-war picture. You can tell by the model of the cars that are in it, but this is what the laboratory looked like during World War II. Now, the building that is sort of top, or I guess maybe center left in this picture, is the community building that's there today. That is where the Teen Center and the National Park Visitor Center are. All of these other, and that building was built after World War II. It was built in 1948, but all of these other buildings were constructed by the United States Army during the war, and all built there right around Ashley Pond. And so we like to, remind our visitors that the laboratory was right here. This was where a lot of the theoretical work was done, some experimental work. Now, experimental explosive work was done behind the laboratory fence, and that is because they didn't want to blow up their laboratories and their homes that were nearby, and so that's why explosives work was moved off-site. And then once enough plutonium got here to do experiments with, that was also moved down DP Road because it's kind of nasty and they didn't want to contaminate any of these other buildings with that. But these two-story Army barracks were the original laboratories, and General Groves, as I said, never intended the town to be permanent. After the war was over, when it was determined the town would be permanent, then of course the new lab buildings were built on South Mesa, and the bridge to connect them was built, the Omega Bridge. And that is the Los Alamos that we know today. But these buildings are the ones that were built during the war and where most of the work was done. One of the things to remember to make sure our visitors understand is that Los Alamos was a military base. We had a significant military population here. The military was in charge of the infrastructure, so all of the housing, the buildings, the roads, all of that was taken care of by the United States Army. The mud. But it was full of civilians. Originally, Groves and Oppenheimer expected that the civilian scientists would be drafted into the Army, because that's what had happened to most of the scientists who worked for the United States government in World War I. But they did not end up doing that, and so you had this very busy military base with this core constituency or core group, if you will, of scientists and engineers living here. They are quite young for the most part, many young families. There were 83 babies born the first year of the project. It absolutely incensed General Groves because he thought all of these civilians were just trying to take advantage of the military hospital and not have to pay, the regular civilian rates that they would have had to pay in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, something like that. And he went to Dr. Oppenheimer quite angry, and he said, "You have to do something about all of these babies being born." And Dr. Oppenheimer was very embarrassed. He said, "First of all, General, these are married couples that are having children. I don't really know what you want me to do about it. By the way, my wife is pregnant." So kind of a tough spot for him to be in. Because this community was fenced in and people had to have passes to come in or to go out, because they couldn't really travel to Santa Fe without security following them and watching them, it became a very closed community. And to deal with that, they started developing community. They made it up as they went along. And so they would put on dances and parties and cultural events. And the Little Theater had its start here in 1943. And the Community Winds had its roots, back in those days. And It was a very active place culturally. Of course, there were a couple of movie theaters, and those, of course, were mostly catering to the military folks, but the civilians could attend. And there were just all kinds of activities that began in this small community and then have continued really to today. And that's one of the things that I like to talk to our visitors about, is that of course we are a scientific community, but we're also very culturally attuned, and we have a lot of artists who live here and a lot of people who do plays and acting. And one great example is Fred Rhinus. Fred Rhinus, who came during the Manhattan Project, who would win the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the neutrino, and whose Nobel Prize is on display in the Hans Bethe House. He was a light opera singer, and we have his name in the programs for the light opera. And in fact, he'd even considered, when he was working on his PhD, going into opera rather than physics, but we're glad he went into physics. There was, of course, all kinds of sports that went on up here, softball teams and baseball teams and those kinds of things. There was also a very competitive chess league, but Hans Bethe usually ended up winning those matches. And it's all top secret. What the scientists and engineers were working on was two separate bombs. The bomb on the bottom on the left is the little boy bomb. This was a uranium bomb. Scientists had two types of fissile material they were working with, uranium-235. If you shoot two pieces of uranium together, essentially, I tell this as a historian, not as a physicist, you will get a critical explosion. The science behind this was pretty well understood. The engineering behind it was, relatively speaking, fairly simple. We also didn't have a lot of uranium. Uranium ore is 0.7% U-235, which is the uranium isotope that the scientists were working with. And so it takes tons of uranium to get just a few grams of, tons of uranium ore to get just a few grams of uranium-235. So the scientists were realizing they could make a bomb. They just did not have a lot of material to work with. And in fact, we would not have enough uranium for a second uranium bomb until November of 1945. The bomb that you see in this picture, the little boy bomb, is the one that was used on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945. The one on the top right is the Fat Man bomb. This one was much more complicated. This was the plutonium device. And scientists discovered pretty early on, if you take two pieces of plutonium and shoot them together as they originally intended, that it would fizzle instead of explode. So they had to figure out a different way to make this fissile material explode. And what they developed was the idea of squishing the plutonium down. If you take a piece about the size of a grapefruit and squeeze it down to about the size of a tangerine, you will get a critical explosion. To do that, you focus your explosions inward, so it's called implosion, I-M as in mom instead of I-N as in Nancy, your implosion bomb. And it was very complicated. They didn't know what kind of high explosives to use. They didn't know what shape those needed to be. They didn't know how to set all the electronics off at the same time. There were so many complications, which is one of the reasons that the population of Los Alamos exploded in 1944. To the point that scientists and their families were being housed down at Bandelier National Monument in tents. So they did develop this implosion device, and not knowing if it would work or not, because it was so complicated, Oppenheimer really wanted to have a test. The test was at Trinity site. This is just outside the McDonald Ranch House. That is the core of the plutonium gadget, which is what everyone in Los Alamos referred. They didn't call them bombs. They called them the gadget or a device. And so this was the core of the gadget at Trinity. It's being taken in this car out to ground zero, where there was a 100-foot tower. And this picture shows the scientists lifting the gadget up to the top of that tower. There was a terrible storm on the night of July 15, 16 of 1945, a lightning storm, and there was actually someone who got to sit up in the metal shed that was at the top of this building and babysit the device so that no one would come in and sabotage it or have any issues. And so if you can imagine sitting through that lightning storm in a metal building on the top of a 100-foot tower, it was quite a challenge. But the test did successfully go off at 5:29 a.m. on July 16th. On the left is the only color picture that was taken of Trinity. There are thousands and thousands of pictures of Trinity that were all taken by the official Manhattan Project photographers. And those were all taken in black and white because black and white was a known technology. Color was fairly new, and they weren't positive it was going to work. In fact, the man who took this shot, Jack Abbey, who was an amateur photographer, said he got three snaps off, but this was the only one of the three that came out. And it is, of course, quite a famous picture. On the right is General Groves and Dr. Oppenheimer at the base of that 100-foot tower that we were just looking at. This is some of the rebar that was left. And the pose of them standing here is this photograph is what the sculptures out by Fuller Lodge are based on. And so if anybody ever asks, those are life-size sculptures, but you can see General Groves isn't quite as pudgy in the sculpture as he is in the photograph. And that was because the sculpturess was working with General Groves' family and agreed to make him look just a little bit slimmer because he really had stressed out and not eaten well by the end of the war. President Truman was in Potsdam meeting with Stalin and Churchill when word came to him that the test of Trinity was successful. And so the United States Army Air Corps was tasked with delivering the bombs from Japan. They left Tinian Island in the South Pacific. And as I said, the uranium bomb, the little boy bomb, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945. This particular picture is the site of the Peace Dome that is part of the Hiroshima Memorial Museum, Hiroshima Memorial Peace Museum that's there today. On August 8th of 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and started sending its troops into Manchuria, where there were significant numbers of Japanese troops. And then on August 9th of 1945, the plutonium bomb, the Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. President Truman ordered that no more bombs be dropped unless he specifically gave orders at this point. The core and components of a third bomb were at the port of Los Angeles ready to go, but they were left there until further word from the president. And finally, I have this 14th, 15th slash here. Most people in the United States say the war ended on August 14th because that's the time it was in the United States. My grandfather was in the Philippines, and he writes in his diary that he will always consider it to be August 15th because he was on that side of the international date line when he heard the word that the war was over. And so in honor of my grandfather, I always mark it as 1415. He was helping to plan the invasion of Japan. And then finally, of course, on September 2nd of 1945, the treaties to end the bloodiest conflict in world history occurred on the USS Missouri. The USS Missouri is stationed in Pearl Harbor. And so if you ever get a chance to visit both Pearl Harbor and the USS Missouri, it's just a wonderful, wonderful experience. And it really kind of brings you full circle on Los Alamos history. Now what's going to happen in Los Alamos? That's such a great question because General Groves never intended for the town to be permanent, for the laboratory to continue to exist, but suddenly the nuclear genie has been let out of the bottle and it doesn't go back in. So as soon as the war was over, something like 2/3 of the workforce ends up leaving Los Alamos. Most of them were in academia and going back to academia, although there were certainly many who were young people in the military. All of those folks left as well. What is the lab's mission going to be? That's a really good question. And so part of it was a military mission came out in 1946, and that was the Crossroads test, which was to test some devices on and the effects that they would have on naval ships. And so those were done down at the Bikini Atoll. In October of 1945, after Oppenheimer leaves, Norris Bradbury is asked to take over as director of the laboratory. He had been here during the project, and he thought he was going to close the lab. He agreed for 6 months to run the laboratory. He actually did it, of course, for 25 years and was our longest serving director. And a huge debate starts raging in Congress over who's going to control nuclear weapons. Is it going to be the military who are off doing these crossroads tests and this kind of thing, or is it going to be civilians? And of course, the determination was that it would be civilians. And on January 1st of 1947, The Atomic Energy Commission, a new civilian agency created by Congress, will take over Los Alamos. So the U.S. Army military base is actually turned over to the AEC. And of course, the entire town is owned by the AEC, and Amy will be telling you more about that in the post-war segment of our training. Everyone was really concerned what happens when the Soviets get the bomb. Everyone knew the Soviets were going to get the bomb. They just thought it was going to be, maybe 5 or 10 years later than they really did, which was, of course, in the summer of 1949, which really accelerated a lot of the work that was going on here at the laboratory. So Norris isn't charged just with finding new mission for the laboratory. He is really charged with developing a new town. One of the things that he asked for before General Groves left office, or before General Groves turned over the military base to the AEC, he asked that some housing be built. That was the western area. And he asked that the main road be paved. If you can imagine, that road was still dirt and still no guardrails during the Manhattan Project. And many of our visitors want to know what's going on at the laboratory today. Of course, the lab employs 11,000 people, and a significant amount of their work is still nuclear weapon related. But because of our nuclear weapons and the fact that we haven't tested a bomb for so many years, means that we have usually one of the fastest computers in the world here in Los Alamos, and that supercomputing is used for things like climate modeling and oceanography here in the mountains of New Mexico, and all kinds of work that needs really big computers that do really quick calculations. Of course, there's a lot of national security work that goes on here, not just nuclear related, but related to things going on in the Middle East and really all over the world. There's a significant amount of environmental cleanup that still goes on, because during the Manhattan Project and early Cold War years, people would throw things out and not necessarily realize what they were throwing out and how dangerous it was to the environment. And so now we have a lot of folks who work in this cleanup. Of course, we have a lot of astrophysics work that goes on, and that's why I'm showing the Mars rover, little Curiosity here with his ChemCam, and he zaps rocks to determine their chemical makeup, and that work was developed here at the laboratory, and there's going to be a new one going up in a few years that we'll have more instruments on. The probe that went out to Pluto, you may remember that was big in the news a few years ago, that is also was built right here at the laboratory. And of course, a lot of health work that goes on here, biological work, health physics, those kinds of things. And energy development. I don't have it on my slide, but this is a Department of Energy laboratory, and there's a lot of energy development work that goes on. So a lot to still do, and to be proud of the work that our community does today. Some resources that you may want to look at, of course, our website. We used to have some history pages up on there. We don't right now, but we will get those up hopefully by the summer of 2018. So if you're listening to this after that and they're not up, I apologize, but if they are up, they should be there. ManhattanProjectVoices.org is over 400 oral histories that have been recorded with Manhattan Project folks from all over, Oak Ridge, Hanford, you name it, and of course Los Alamos. These are mostly video oral histories. They are mostly transcribed. It's searchable. It is just a fabulous, fabulous database, and a wonderful opportunity to listen to people who were here during that time. And our partner on that Manhattan Project Voices website is the Atomic Heritage Foundation, which is based in Washington, D.C., and does a lot of great work for preservation of atomic history. So would encourage you to look through their website and subscribe to their newsletter, because they always have updates about different things going on around the country related to our work. Books that I cannot recommend enough are 109 East Palace by Jeanette Conant and Inside Box 1663 by Eleanor Jetty. Jeanette Conant was the granddaughter of James Conant, who was the president of Harvard University and one of the top advisors on the Manhattan Project. She used her grandfather's notes, but she's just a wonderful storyteller, and she really tells, I think, the best popular history. It's also the best seller in the museum. Inside Box 1663 is a insider's view of what it was like. Of course, Box 1663 was the post office box in Santa Fe that all of the civilian mail came to in Los Alamos, and caused quite a big hubbub. I think it was with Sears and Roebuck, who was concerned about sending 400 catalogs to the same address. Making the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes is a fantastic book. It is very heavy on physics, so if that's not your thing, These other ones might be better for you. And then Tales of Los Alamos by Bernice Brode is just another kind of like Eleanor Jetty's book. It's just a really great insider's look at what Los Alamos was like during the project. Eleanor Jetty has a very wicked sense of humor. Bernice is a little bit more straightforward in her storytelling. So again, if you have any questions about any of this, please do contact me. You can stop by my office, which is in the north wing of Fuller Lodge, or just shoot me an email, heather@losalamoshistory.org, and I will look forward to helping you out. Thank you so much again for volunteering for us, and have a great time out there.